I would add to that that we've all seen, that is, those of us who've looked at it have seen plenty of footage indicating that the fires in the Twin Towers were essentially, if not extinguished, nearly so. They were certainly oxygen-starved fires. They were billowing out black smoke, which is a sign of a choked-out fire. They were not raging fires, and even if they had been fully encompassing the building, that should not have brought the buildings down, because we've had numerous examples of steel-framed sky rises totally engulfed in fire for up to 18, more than 24 hours, and I think in one of the cases, that did not collapse. The steel should not melt as the result of a typical fire. And the last point I want to make in response to what Charles so well said was that the FEMA investigators, talking about the jet fuel that was on the aircraft, because a lot of people say, oh no, you people are crazy and you're forgetting the fact that these planes were full of jet fuel. Well, they did have jet fuel on them, of course, but even the investigators who wrote the reports on the collapses agreed that the jet fuel was essentially burned off in the first 10 minutes. Most of that happened in a big fireball outside of the buildings right at impact. So in effect, the jet fuel had no role in the collapses. The whole story fails, and you know, if you have any doubt of it, just think about the fact that the buildings fell at essentially free fall speed while crashing down through cold, stone cold, undamaged steel floors. You can't go that fast through an intact structure. It's just not possible. And also at the same time, ejecting debris outwards, hundreds of yards, tonnage of steel. We have one member of our local group who happens to be a professor of physics, and she says she kicks herself, this person does, because she should have known. Any person with a marginal understanding of physics should have known on 9/11 that the whole story was a lie, but she didn't. Like most of us, she went along with it for a long time.
Just high school physics isn't enough. In high school, we learned that F equals ma, and the acceleration of gravity is 32 feet per second, and you can calculate how fast something's going to fall. If you throw a ball off the top of a 100-story building, when is it going to hit the ground? Well, that's how fast that top story came down. And is that just common sense? Is that possible when you have all that steel and all that material in between? I don't think so.
One of the difficulties was moving from an analysis of the Twin Towers to an analysis of Building 7. And for the NIST report to make the theory at all credible, they had to assume that at least 10 of the major core columns were damaged by the impact, were severed by the impact of the plane. And then, of course, the dumping of the jet fuel presumably weakened other columns. So this was the theory for the Twin Towers. Now, their initial report did not address Building 7 at all. And you can see the difficulty that they would have with that, because in Building 7, there was no plane impact. There was no jet fuel coming in from a plane. And so that there was no severed columns that could have conceivably operated even under the same assumptions that were used for the Twin Towers. And so they waited until 2008, after 5 years of analysis, to come up with some scenario in which Building 7 could have had a simultaneous structural meltdown. And all they could come up with was paper trash. All they could come up with was the small fires that had blown over from the South Tower, had somehow ignited furniture, memorandum, and of course, the paper load in these buildings, as NIST itself admitted, was relatively light. And it was just an incredible inconsistency. If you have one theory that depends upon plane impact and the dumping of jet fuel, and you're trying to explain the same building collapse in a third case, where you've eliminated those variables, you're just reaching for unsubstantiated hypothesis. And that's why, of course, they first couldn't cope with Building 7, and when they finally did, they came up with a very unpersuasive explanation.
Well, we were talking about Muhammad Atta's passport coming down through all those flames and surviving, and Pete mentioned that the investigation is very quick, and they came up with who did it right away. So they came up with 19 names of hijackers that caused this. They came up with these names in spite of the fact that everybody in 2 of the planes got killed when they crashed into the buildings. But somehow they knew who it was. But now, hasn't it turned out that some of those supposed hijackers have turned up alive over in Saudi Arabia and other countries, and they've come to the embassies and said, please take my name off the list because here I am, I'm alive. Does anybody remember that?
I think the BBC had done an investigation right after and looked into that. I think that was really probably the only paper, and they said something about one guy he was a pilot in Saudi Arabia, and they found half a dozen people, but nobody ever really followed up on that. So it's really, I think, it was only one source, but that's just another kind of question, is why wasn't that looked into? But obviously they couldn't look into that because that would destroy the main basis for their, they found this luggage, it had all the pictures and names in it, and that's how they figured it out. And it was left in a rental car, and that's pretty much, most of their evidence really was in this little bag they found in Muhammad Atta's rental car. But nobody ever followed up. So at some point real soon after 9/11, I think within a week, the BBC did this thing and claimed that, but then nobody else ever checked that out. So I wouldn't necessarily say it was 100% certain, but nobody checked it out. It's like anything else. There was really no investigation, a normal criminal investigation done they knew, which also begs the question, if you knew who did it within hours afterwards, but then claimed that they had no idea it was going to happen, it doesn't make sense, because the only way they could have known is that they were following these guys, which we later found out that they were, that people had been following these guys around the country for months and months and months, and so what they're telling us is their intelligence is really, really bad, which we, all the billions of dollars we pay to protect our country. At one time they're saying we're saying we have the best this in the world and the best that, but we were so bad on 9/11 that we couldn't stop any of these things from happening. It's just, once again, it's common sense. And then some FBI agents came forward and said, we were telling you guys about this, that there was a problem, something was going to happen, and nobody wanted to listen to us. So, we didn't know anything about this. Condoleezza Rice had the famous statement that, we had no idea, that people could use planes as weapons, and it was said over and over again. And in fact, I think it was just yesterday or the day before that they found another training exercise was run 2 days before 9/11, a military drill where a hijacked plane was going to fly over New York City and explode and rain down debris all over the city. But then they made this claim, and apparently there was many war exercises going on that simulated that, but there was one that closely resembled what happened 2 days before, but all these people said that they had no idea this could happen, which it's just, it's not plausible. Pretty much every statement they've made about the attacks over the years has turned out to be false.
That's why we need a new investigation.
Right, and I think it's important that we should say that, those of us, at least the ones I know about in Vermont, who are looking at these questions, we're not claiming that there were no Muslim terrorists. We're not claiming to know what happened. All we're saying is that the evidence doesn't support the official story and that we really need a new investigation. One of the things that I think is undeniable, talking about the evidence that does exist for the alleged hijackers, is that several of these alleged hijackers, whoever they were, do not appear to have been religious extremists. And this is something that David Ray Griffin, among others, have done a lot of research into. I think the author that Pete mentioned earlier about what was happening in Southwest Florida did a lot of research into this. There were contemporary news reports through the mainstream media prior to 9/11, I should say shortly after 9/11, talking about the fact that several of these hijackers were known to have frequented bars, to have hired prostitutes, to have abused drugs, alcohol, all behaviors that you would not expect from a Muslim, a very religious Muslim extremist, a terrorist. And And so we're not saying that these people weren't involved. We're not saying they weren't on the planes. I don't know where they were. But I think there's a legitimate question. What role did they really have? Could they have been patsies? Could they have been part of a plan to make it appear that there was a real attack going on? Maybe they were real attackers, but they didn't have the means to actually carry them out. We do know that some of the flight schools, the instructors there, have testified that the alleged pilots who flew these planes, particularly the one into the Pentagon, absolutely could not have done it. Did not have the skills to fly a 757, could not fly a small Cessna. So the point is, I think we're all looking at the questions and we're saying the evidence does not fit the official story, but don't misquote us into saying, we know what happened. We don't know what happened. We don't know who was involved. We don't know the extent of the actual foreign terrorists, and we're not saying they didn't exist.